This morning's Sunday Times dropped what could be the most damaging personal story of Sir Keir Starmer's premiership. It concerns a 7-acre field behind his parents' house in Oxted in Surrey, and Starmer bought it in 1996 for £20,000 so his parents could keep rescue donkeys. But he didn't simply gift it to them. Instead, he created what tax lawyers call a life interest trust. His parents could use the land for the rest of their lives, but legal ownership stayed with him, and the field would revert to him when they died. On its face, this sounds like a quaint family arrangement, but legally it had one major consequence. The land was excluded from his parents' inheritance tax estate. Section 54 of the Inheritance Tax Act 1984 says that if a settler, the person who creates the trust, survives the trust beneficiaries, the property is not counted in the beneficiary's estate for inheritance tax purposes. Had Starmer simply gifted the land, it would have been valued and declared on his father's death in 2018. Because of the trust, it was treated as still belonging to him and skipped the inheritance tax calculation altogether. Starmer later sold the field in 2022 for about £295,000, and at the time of his father's death, the family's estate was recorded at £374,091. If the field's eventual sale price had been included, the estate would have been about £670,000. Whether that extra value would have actually triggered inheritance tax is debatable. Today's nil-rate band and residence allowance would likely have kept the estate below the £875,000 combined threshold. But in 1996, when Starmer set up the trust, the basic threshold was only £200,000, and there was no residence nil-rate band. It was therefore a classic piece of prudent tax planning, legally advantageous. Starmer has built much of his personal persona on fair taxation and closing loopholes. As the Labour leader, he said, those in charge of taxation can't be seeking to avoid it. He attacked both corporate and personal tax avoidance and recently tightened inheritance tax reliefs on farmland in his own budget, angering farmers. Angela Rayner, his former deputy, resigned over irregularities in her own property tax affairs. The comparison is obvious and uncomfortable. Number 10 insists there was no intent to dodge tax. His only consideration was the well-being of his parents, yet it refuses to explain why he used a trust rather than a simple gift, and reporters say Downing Street sat on straightforward questions for weeks before bringing in a leading tax KC to check the paperwork. The optics are especially bad because Starmer's parents' donkey field sounds small-scale and innocent, but the structure used is one familiar to private client lawyers advising wealthy families. It's important to separate lawfulness from political vulnerability. Legally, no tax appears to have been underpaid. HMRC couldn't challenge this structure. Ethically and politically, critics say a man who vowed to clamp down on avoidance chose a mechanism widely understood to reduce tax exposure. Even if the eventual bill was zero either way, the intention matters. Dan Needle of the Tax Policy Associates, who helped analyse the case, says the trust was a tax-efficient structure, and though it may have turned out irrelevant because the estate stayed below the threshold, Starmer could not have known future thresholds in 1996. Creating a life interest trust was prudent if your aim was to keep assets outside the inheritance tax net. Why this lands at a bad moment? The timing could hardly be worse because Labour's annual conference opens today in Liverpool. Starmer's personal ratings are at historic lows for a new Prime Minister. Reform UK is exploiting anger over Labour's inheritance tax reforms among rural and small business voters. The government has already lost its deputy leader to a tax row, and even if this never becomes a legal problem, it feeds the narrative of Labour hypocrisy, a Labour Prime Minister promising fairness while using legal devices unavailable or unknown to most ordinary families. The likely fallout here expect several lines of attack. Conservative and Reform MPs will claim double standards. He taxes farmers but shields his own land. The media will compare him to Angela Rayner, and backbench unease will grow. Some Labour MPs fear A slow burn integrity scandal on the eve of difficult fiscal choices. Starmer's defence, that he only wanted to help his parents, is emotionally appealing but leaves the technical question unanswered. If he cannot explain why he used a trust, not a gift, critics will call it stealthy avoidance. This is not a smoking gun of illegality, but politics is not a courtroom. It's about trust, perception, and narrative consistency. And a leader who promised to clean up Britain's tax culture now faces accusations of quietly exploiting it. At a time when his polling is fragile and his party is wrestling with hard fiscal choices, this story has the potential to stick, not because of the money saved, but because of the story it tells about character and credibility.